The Charlotte Ledger Podcast is a member of the Queen City Podcast Network.
Hey, it's Cristina Bolling from the Charlotte Ledger, and you're listening to the Charlotte Ledger Podcast. Today, we've got a traveling roadshow episode of the podcast in which I spoke with Tom Gabbard, President and CEO of Blumenthal Arts, in front of a live audience at the Sharon at South Park Retirement Community. Besides leading one of Charlotte's biggest arts organizations, Tom Gabbard is a lifetime member of the Broadway League, and he's been a voter on the Tony Awards for nearly 3 decades. So we had lots to talk about, from what arts organizations like Blumenthal Arts are doing to adapt to changing audiences, to how he gets big shows to come to Charlotte, and what it was like being in the room when Lin-Manuel Miranda first pitched Hamilton. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Tom Gabbard. Thanks again, Tom, for being here.
Thank you for the opportunity.
I wanted to start by talking a little bit about your background. I read that you attended Pepperdine as a performance major. And so I was wondering, in your career, when did you take the turn into arts administration? And do you ever think back about performance, about, it being a road not traveled?
I was lucky to grow up in a family whose parents were ready to carpool me to all sorts of places. So I was very active growing up in instrumental music. I played the French horn. But I think I always understood that I enjoyed the organizational side, making things happen. And so even as a 4th grader, when I decided, I went to go see the U.S. Marine Corps Band at the San Jose Civic Auditorium in California. And that's when I decided that's what I want to do. And about 6 months later, added to it that I aspired to be a high school band director. Well, I'm not a high school band director, and yet it involves a lot of the same skills. Organizing, being involved with the arts, community management, a whole host of those things. So I've always blended the performance piece, but I was very active as a performer. My parents were retired when I went off to college. They gave me a car, and that was it. They loved me a lot, but they didn't have resources. So I was fortunate to get a full tuition scholarship through college. But I began taking business classes, and right out of my undergrad work, went to school in San Francisco and got an MBA in arts management. And so this interweaving of the arts and having the passion of a performer, understanding of the challenges that performers face, but ultimately realizing, I want to make these things happen. I want to be the business person that helps realize these dreams. I think I may just be wired to be that.
I wanted you to talk about the balance of what Blumenthal does, because a lot of people, I think, when they think about Blumenthal, they might think about some of the Broadway light series shows that come in. But there's also so many resident companies that are part of Blumenthal. And now you have the immersive component. And I'm wondering, when you think about kind of the mix of what Blumenthal does, is there a formula to it, or how do you figure out what that balance is going to be of the things that are coming in nationally, but then all of our homegrown kind of arts?
It is an incredibly wonderful mix, a bouillabaisse of all sorts of wonderful things that we're always adding ingredients, maybe taking away an ingredient every now and then. But it's all reflective of trying to serve the community and to expand the community that we serve. Blumenthal has always been this really interesting hybrid that brought in, big name shows like we just closed Hamilton, but is home for grassroots groups and professional local groups like the Symphony and Charlotte Ballet. But I do think this goal of continuing to try to figure out what will it take to get somebody in the doors who hasn't been there before. We've always had this goal of serving everyone, but at the end of the day, it takes the right programming and things to attract them in. And so over time, as we've found various niches there was 3 years, we brought a show from London called Breaking Convention, an international hip hop festival. I knew nothing about hip hop. We learned a lot about hip hop. But part of it was because we had a sense that there was a portion of our community that hadn't come through the doors because the product wasn't right. Now we've gotten into immersive productions and opened a fabulous place that we call Bloom Studios. It's at the historic Charlotte Pipe and Foundry campus, now known as the Iron District. And part of what led us out there, again, was an expansion of the audience, realizing, here's how I put it to my board a few years ago when we decided to do this. I said, so does anybody know of somebody that their worst possible nightmare is being stuck in a fixed seat for 2 hours because they're antsy, they're mobile, they want to touch things, they want to talk back, whatever? I said, we are doing this for them. We haven't been able to serve that niche until we found a way to create a style of presentation where you are mobile, where you do move around, where you do interact with other people. So again, it's constantly driven by this desire to expand. I do think we take seriously our role as stewards of fantastic facilities and trying to use them in smart ways that elevate the community, that particularly for our young people, that enrich their minds, enrich their understanding of the world, that enrich their understanding of other cultures. We take that seriously, and that led us to things like the Charlotte International Arts Festival, where we really wanted to shine a bright light on local international groups, local international artists, and to celebrate that Charlotte, in fact, is a global community. I think a lot of people don't think of Charlotte that way, but we are a global community. So we created that as a way to further expand the audience and to connect with an even broader group in the community.
That was going to be my next question, was to ask you about these sort of immersive experiences. I guess when I think about the ones that have happened so far, Immersive Van Gogh seemed to me to be one. Was that like a light bulb moment for you that these are the types of programs that we need, or had you already gone down that path before that Immersive Van Gogh, which was incredibly attended, right? And it was extended and extended.
Yeah, having flexible spaces where you can set things up in different ways, that is something that's always been something I've been interested in. Immersive Van Gogh was a really interesting story. This style of digital art that's projected on walls and in unusual spaces was something I'd become familiar with, and particularly a place in Paris that really pioneered this, the Alter Lumiere. I'd been there twice before COVID and was really interested in the art form, but didn't quite know what to do with it. So during COVID, we had to furlough a lot of people. Our staff is typically about full-time, about 120. We're up to about 130 now. And I held on to as many as I could. And then about 4 months in, we had to downsize significantly and continue to downsize. And I spent literally every day while many of my colleagues headed off to the beach waiting for this all to end, I spent every day trying to figure out, how do I get my people back to work? And we couldn't do shows. It wasn't safe to do it. It wasn't legal to do it. And so when a producer friend of mine in Toronto called me and said, hey, I've just opened this thing called Immersive Van Gogh, and he said, there's something here. I don't quite understand, but there's something here. He starts explaining it. I said, Corey, you don't have to explain. I opened my iPad. I said, my screensaver is a picture from the Alter Lumiere of Immersive Van Gogh that had been there several years earlier. And I said, I'm in. Let's figure this out. So our board at Blumenthal, to their great credit, in January of 21, which was among the darkest times of that pandemic, our board gave me approval to proceed on doing that. And I saved the PowerPoint slide that they looked at in the vote. Number one goal was to get our people back to work. And we set as a target a minimum of 200. We eventually got 400 people back to work. Secondly, it was to reacclimate people to being indoors again, because that routine had been ended. And so to go into this warehouse, 75,000 square feet, and be able to spread things out, we designed it in a way that when people went to the show, there were projected circles on the floor, and they had to stay in the circle until they moved. I described it as hopping between lily pads. So we designed it in a very safe way. And the third goal was to manage our risk so that we at least broke even. And so what people don't realize from that run of a little over 6 months, in that era where a lot of these digital art shows were happening, ours in Charlotte was the largest of any of these digital art shows in North America. They were out there with other artists besides Van Gogh, and our production here in Charlotte attracted over 300,000 was the largest in North America. Now that art form, about a year and a half later, fell off a cliff because it was a trend. And that was part of the decision. I explained to our board, I said, look, I think there's a moment here that this is the right thing to do, the right time to do it, but it's not going to last forever. So this is going to mean we're going to open in a 100-year-old warehouse in the middle of June in North Carolina with no air conditioning. It's going to mean we're going to do that, but we do it now or never. And to their everlasting credit, they supported that, and we opened an entirely new door. But most of all, got people back to work, including local artists. I mean, I was primarily concerned with our own staff, but we designed Immersive Van Gogh so that local artists had an opportunity to work there, showcase their work. Over $600,000 in direct payments went to those artists, and significant payments after it, because Immersive Van Gogh was in 20 other cities, and much of that work was sold in merch in other cities. So do I sound a little bit proud of our team for what we accomplished then, and our board, that they would have the courage to do something like that? But that opened up the door to saying, okay, we're on the right track. This 100-year-old warehouse was a bit of a nightmare. So we began looking for another space, and it took us a little over 2 years to finally connect with Charlotte Pipe and Foundry. But it was worth the wait to find a great space.
You had mentioned that the idea for Immersive Van Gogh germinated during a trip to France. And I wanted to see if you could talk about your travel and how you all go and find things to bring back to Charlotte. I understand travel is a huge part of that. So can you talk about that a little bit?
It is a huge part of this. You know, it's whether or not it's in our proper theaters or in immersive. These are not the kind of things you can order up on Amazon. And particularly the way we approach it, that we want things that are fresh and new, that we may be bringing to the U.S. for the very first time, or if we have partners, we'll have it in Charlotte within the first 12 months that it lands in North America. So we spend a lot of time searching. You know, these ventures require multiple partners. It's not just a matter of us saying, well, we want this for Charlotte. Well, we have to find 2, 3, 4 other cities that are also interested, and putting together a small venture partnership to be able to do these things. And even with Broadway shows, I'm very involved with the Broadway industry, and among places like Blumenthal, the Kennedy Center, Denver Center for the Performing Arts, we organize investment in Broadway shows. So I will frequently be invited to be in the room very first time they read the script with a cast, the very first time they do a workshop. And so, you know, we're doing all these things to create coalitions and partnerships for these shows, but ultimately for Charlotte, it is the end game here is always bringing the show to Charlotte. And so getting out there and building relationships, you know, like I said, we just closed Hamilton, and I was in the room where it happened when Lin pitched the show to a bunch of us 6 years before it opened on Broadway. And we were all like, Lin, are you sure? This sounds a little bit odd. And so, you know, I get a chance to hear all those things. But again, it helps Charlotte, that saying about punching above their weight class. Charlotte has been able to punch above its weight class because we are so proactive to go out and find these things.
I was hoping that you were going to tell a little behind-the-scenes story about something like Hamilton. I remember talking to you once, and you mentioned Six, that perhaps you saw Six in a fringe festival.
Yeah, okay. I actually saw it before the Brit Kenny Wax, who went on to produce it, because its first production was at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. And for years, I've gone most years, and will be there 5 to 7 days to see that. And so Six, it was in a tent, seating for 500 and a tiny stage, not any room for scenery or whatever. And that's where we first saw Six. And we had with us a couple of our trustee and his wife, George Raftelis and Eva, who at that time I think were 72 or 73. And then we had a number of our millennials on staff. And when I looked at all of them afterwards, and they were just beaming and loved it, and I realized, okay, this is going to be something. And so, as I always do, you know, then I reach out to key people and say, how can we help you? How can we help you? They were fortunate to not need my help ultimately, but we're eternally grateful for that. We were there in New York when it opened. So, we try to identify these things early and then identify how can we be helpful. These shows, people don't realize in their early days how fragile they are. And just to give you another insider show, finish the Lin story. Lin came, we manage a group that includes the Kennedy Center, large performing arts centers called the Independent Presenters Network. And we manage the group here in Charlotte. It's about 60% of the touring Broadway business. And so we invite producers to come in and meet with us. And so Jeffrey Seller, a producer of shows like Rent and Avenue Q and now Hamilton, Jeffrey came and he said, okay, 3 shows I'm working on that you guys should keep in mind. And so he said, first one is we're working with Sting on a new musical that he's writing called The Last Ship. And then he said, I directed shows in college. He went to Michigan, never have since. I'm going to go back and I'm going to try directing a show. And it's an adaptation of Peter Pan called Fly. And then he brought Lin with him. And he said, Lin is working on this thing called Hamilton. And I saved the sheet. It's an 8.5 by 11 Xerox sheet that had 10 play money. It had 3 $10 play money bills on it. And so Lin explained it to us, said he was going to do a mixtape, and we're all we don't quite get this. So in these meetings, I do a straw poll of what people might be interested in getting behind and investing in. So I do the straw poll. Of course, everybody was interested in The Last Ship because it's Sting, this great. And then number 2 was Fly because it's Peter Pan. And then number 3 was Hamilton because we love Lin, but we don't quite understand what this thing is.
And which one have we all heard of?
Yeah, the Fly, he did a production of it at the Dallas Theater Center, decided it wasn't worth it, stopped it right there. The Last Ship closed at a total loss on Broadway, and then Hamilton.
I was wondering what it's like to be a voter for the Tony Awards, and how many shows do you have to go to each year, and how do you manage to fit that all in?
It is, an incredible honor, and I do have lifetime status, so I will be lucky to continue to vote until I just decide, I'm not able to. On Broadway, we typically have anywhere from about 35 to 42 shows a year and this is just new shows. In London, the awards extend to replacements in a show, but in New York, it's the original production or the revival of that production, and that's usually 35 to 42, sometimes even 45 shows a year. It's a lot of shows. And a little bit like the Academy Awards, many of the shows open late in the season. The season usually ends the very end of April. And so there's this rush of shows looking to qualify at the end of the season. As an out-of-town voter, I have to watch it really carefully because increasingly, especially star-driven vehicles, they will only play a limited run of 12, 14, maybe 16 weeks. That's it. So I keep a spreadsheet and then track these shows. And I actually see some of these shows more than once. I'm very lucky to be invited to most opening nights. And so if I go to see a show on opening night, I will go back usually a second time because I want to hear it with a real audience. Opening night audiences are really for family and friends. It's kind of a send-off, very celebratory. So the reactions are not normal. So frequently I will go back and see it a second time with a normal audience. I believe our award show that is usually the second Sunday in June is the best award show out there. And I've studied all the others, the Academy Awards, the Grammys, all the others. And I think our show has a lot more heart, but also the way that we, in terms of the voting, I think is far more fair. With the Academy Awards, they do it by specialization. And the only thing that everybody votes on is Best Picture. With the Tony Awards, there are only typically about 800 of us. So we vote on all categories. You have to certify that you've seen every show in that category, and they actually keep track of that just to make sure people are honest. But there are a very limited number of us that have been given that responsibility, so I take it very seriously.
I was following a couple of shows with Charlotte ties for the last couple months. The Eyes of Tammy Faye, about Tammy Faye Baker, and then
Swept Away,
from the Avett Brothers. And both had a hard time.
They did. Yeah, and we were investors in both. Actually, Swept Away, because not only was the music from the Avett Brothers, hometown heroes, but one of the producers, Matthew Matson, I think he went to Myers Park High. So he's a Charlotte kid. So he came to me, 2016, I think, and talked to me about it and said, I need some help with some money to hire John Logan to write the script. And so we actually provided what's called first money to help them put the show together. So we've been tracking that for a while. And we were investors in Tammy Faye. You know, it was heartbreaking for both shows to not be successful. It is nearly impossible these days in New York for a show to be successful. The economics are so difficult and the environment is so difficult that it is hard. So my heart went out to both. And interestingly, now the momentum on theater has really shifted to London. And Tammy Faye represented an interesting comparison in that it was written, the music for it was written by Elton John. Elton John was an incredible Tammy Faye supporter. That's what drove his wanting to do this story, was he was such a fan of hers. But he also wrote the music for a musicalization of the film The Devil Wears Prada, and were investors in that as well. So they actually opened within a few weeks of each other. One in London, another in New York. They both got middling reviews. You know, the New York press was probably harsher on Tammy Faye, but neither of them got great reviews. By comparison, The Devil Wears Prada, has announced an extension. It's playing well into October and probably beyond. Tammy Faye, 4 days after its opening, announced its closing. So honestly, I think it was a real difference between New York and London. And that's why, I'm advising a lot of producers to go to London, go to the UK to start their shows, and then bring them to the US, and maybe even skip Broadway. Just come to Charlotte and some other cities and skip New York, because the press there is just so problematic. And audiences listen to the press a little bit more there than they do in New York, in London. In London, they're much more, I don't care, I like it. But I know for both productions, it was heartbreaking for them.
I wanted to kind of end our conversation on a curious note, and then I'd love to open it up to questions from you all. I'm wondering, as you look back on your career here in Charlotte, if there have been any that got away, productions or performers who you wanted to bring, who you haven't been able to bring, or things that you've done that maybe didn't take off in the way that you wanted them to?
Oh, there's plenty of those, as my staff will tell you, because it's something, I have a lot of young staff, and so the mentorship of those young staff is really important. And I share with them that one philosophy as to how I approach this work is, when people ask me, so what do you do all day? And I said, I spend 90% of my time talking about things that never happened. And that may sound crazy, and yet that is a part of the process to get to the 10% that should happen. And these things, sometimes they don't happen just because the timing's not right. There are factors that have nothing to do with the quality of the work or whatever. It's just pure timing. And so that's where you have to keep working these things and realize, that sometimes it takes a few years. Some of you may have come to see Back to the Future that we played this summer, a musical version of the film Back to the Future. I was one of the first 4 partners 10 years earlier, and that took so long that, sometimes the auditors would talk to me about taking off the books. I said, no, I think it's still going to happen. You're kidding. It's been sitting there for years. So timing sometimes is what, is at the heart of it. But again, Charlotte has been such a great community here for me to do what I do. I feel very lucky that it's a privilege to be in a city with arts lovers like we have here.
Well, I'm going to go full Oprah Winfrey right now and come around with a microphone and let me know if you have a question for Tom Gabbard.
Tom, we've lived in Charlotte 50 years, and we've seen the arts when they were down and when they were coming up. Where do you think the arts are now? Your gut feeling. Are we on the rise? Or are we where we should be? Or what?
I think we're on the rise. There's no question that, like a lot of things are changing very fast. The arts are changing fast. I'd say Charlotte has been more willing to embrace that change than some other cities. I just came last week, the Broadway League leadership, we meet every other year for a few days to just contemplate business. And when I hear from some of my colleagues that are in older cities like Pittsburgh, and I hear some of their struggles, I'm thankful I'm here. And, some of it is because we've had this influx of young knowledge workers and people that are in the creative class. They're not all bankers. There are people that want to be in a creatively oriented city. And so particularly now, as we've gotten into some of this immersive work, it has really made me aware that there is, a young creative class here in Charlotte that is really hungry to roll up their shirt sleeves and do some of these things. So, I just hear often enough from visitors who come through, and then they're in meetings in various places where they have a chance to assess the creative energy to say, there is something unusual here in Charlotte.
Has there ever been a play that became popular without going to New York or London?
Oh, boy, you're on prime territory for me here. And again, coming back from a thought leaders meeting last week, I've been a huge advocate that we need to be able to source these things without being reliant on New York, not to keep coming back to COVID, but we started talking about supply chains, and problems with supply chains. And I told my colleagues, I said, New York is our China. And it's a bottleneck for healthy cities like Charlotte. So we have to figure out another way to source this. And so I think there finally is some acknowledgement that especially the well-branded IP, the intellectual property like the film titles and things like that, it doesn't need New York. And in fact, frankly, has more to lose financially and the critics, that are not kind to it. So stay away from New York. And so we're doing more of that, where we'll develop shows, and particularly if we can start in the UK and then bring them to the US, tour to places like Charlotte and never touch New York. And so we're working on hybrid models where a show may touch New York for the summer, but it's not going to launch there.
What is the trend in the use of public monies to support the arts?
Oh, the trend of public money. Boy, that's a problematic arena. And, and I think it's a confused trend right now. And yet there's an essential place for that public money to create affordability, access, with the approach we've taken with the Charlotte International Arts Festival, for instance. Most everything is free, most of it's outdoors. And I've been adamant that it needs to be that. If we can't do it free outdoors for families and all of that, then we're just not going to do it. And we've had trouble cobbling together public money for that. But that's the kind of thing where I think there is a role for government. Blumenthal does a good job of paying its own way when we can, but there's plenty that we can't. Our Bloomie Awards, where without any cost to these young people, we have programs for these students in musical theater, and we bring in coaches from New York. We do a lavish show where they are celebrated. And yeah, there's a ticket price for the show, but everything the students experience is entirely free. And there's got to be a place for government support to support some of those things. But the mechanisms are challenging and always politically controversial. Anytime you talk about tax dollars, you can't ignore the fact that it is hard to sort through all of the divisiveness that exists around that. But at the end of the day, it's really crucial.
I'd like to thank Tom Gabbard for being our guest today.
My pleasure.
This episode of the Charlotte Ledger podcast was produced by Lindsay Banks. For more information about the Charlotte Ledger or to subscribe to one of our newsletters, visit thecharlotteledger.com.
QueenCityPodcastNetwork.com.